The best way to start this video is by asking a very simple question. What ruined the Advance Wars franchise? Well, there's actually several different answers. The game I'm looking at today, Advance Wars Days of Ruin, or if you're in Europe, Dark Conflict, is one of those reasons, but it's much more than that. For starters, the Advance Wars franchise was never all that popular in terms of sales numbers. Looking at Wikipedia, not a single Advance Wars game shows up as a million seller on either Game Boy Advance or Nintendo DS. However, every single Advance Wars game received high critical praise, with the GBA game scoring a 92 and 89 on Metacritic, and the DS game scoring a 90 and 86. So quality was never an issue, it just didn't seem to catch on. What did catch on was the Fire Emblem franchise. Popular in Japan from the very beginning, Fire Emblem began to gain some steam worldwide with the Sacred Stones on GBA and Path of Radiance on GameCube. Then it grew even more with Radiant Dawn on Wii and Shadow Dragon on DS, before exploding with Fire Emblem Awakening on 3DS in 2012. Not only is Awakening the second highest rated 3DS game of all time behind Ocarina of Time 3D, but it sold over 2 million copies worldwide since launch. And I won't even get into just how crazy popular Three Houses on Switch has been. Now, why is the emergence of Fire Emblem important to the downfall of Advance Wars? Well, they're both developed by Intelligent Systems and they're both grid-based tactical games. Additionally, Intelligent Systems is one of the busiest developers in the world. Since the launch of Days of Ruin at the beginning of 2008, they've worked on 30 different projects ranging from DSi games to the WarioWare franchise to the Paper Mario franchise and even codenamed Steam, which was somehow greenlit over a 3DS Advance Wars game. But I'll save my codename Steam rant for a future video because I have a lot to say about that game. There was also the spin-off franchise Battalion Wars, which had a game on GameCube and a sequel on Wii, though Intelligent Systems had nothing to do with the development. Neither game performed particularly well critically or commercially, and the franchise hasn't seen a new entry since 2007. It was just another knock against the franchise that had so much potential. Now, with Advance Wars Days of Ruin, it released in January 2008, meaning we're in our 14th year of no new Advance Wars game. The Switch version of the first two games coming out this year is a step in the right direction for the future of the franchise, but it's nothing actually new. Ironically, Days of Ruin wasn't released in Japan until 2013, 5 years after it came out elsewhere. Not only that, it was a download-only 3DS title for Club Nintendo members in Japan. Yeah, not exactly a vote of confidence for the franchise by Nintendo. With the first three Advance Wars games, sure, the theme was war, but it never delved into anything more than surface level, oh no, the bad guys are attacking, we have to stop them themes. Even with the backdrop of war, they still kept a light tone, and with my favorite entry in the franchise, Dual Strike, they went over the top when it came to CO powers, making the game less about the people on the battlefield and more about just unleashing crazy powers. Then Advance Wars Days of Ruin came along and, well, let me sum up the story for you as quick as I can and you decide what changed. Right off the bat, Days of Ruin starts with the world being destroyed by a massive meteor shower. All hope seems to be lost. Then the protagonist Will wakes up in a wasteland and is immediately attacked by someone who is willing to take all of Will's possessions and leave his corpse on the ground. Cheery. Compare that to Advance Wars Dual Strike, where the game starts off with a quick recap of the previous game, then tells you the Butthole Army is back once again. The first mission sends you into training with Jake using friendly units, no one's life is truly at risk, and the two COs have playful banter going between them the entire fight. Plus, the bright, colorful units and landscape are in stark contrast to the dreary presentation of the sequel. Thankfully, after the horrid start in the story, Days of Ruin does throw you a bone. Captain Brenner and Lynn show up and save Will, but the fun doesn't stop there. You learn that Will watched everyone around him at the academy die, he was trapped in the mess hall for weeks, and he had to dig himself out. Oh, and the sky is covered in ash, and no one's seen the sun since the meteor shower. While on your second mission, a scavenger mission, you find nothing but bodies before being attacked. To stick with the doom and gloom theme of Days of Ruin, your tank's cannon has no ammo, so you have to protect your artillery unit and attack from afar. While doing that, you find a mysterious girl in the rubble and rescue her. She has amnesia and can't remember her name, yet has a vast knowledge of the Rubinel army. Anyways, at the outset of Days of Ruin, you're just dealing with a group of raiders who want to murder everyone, as well as some scheming civilians. While all of this is going on, the game reminds you that letting a unit die in battle has real-world repercussions because that's one less person in an already bleak world. You should begin picking up a theme here, but this isn't even the worst of it. The story gets so much more depressing. After dealing with the bandits, you locate a factory that can produce food for your growing band of soldiers and civilians. However, a mysterious new group of enemies appear and attack you. Not only do they have a mega powerful war tank at their disposal, they came to the location not to kill you, but to destroy the factory, ensuring you starve to death. Before you even have a chance to breathe after that revelation, you learn of a deadly flower virus called Creeping Derangea that only infects those under the age of 20. Yay! There is some good news though. Isabella, the mysterious girl you found who has knowledge about everything, has found a shelter capable of housing and feeding 1,000 people. The game's definitely turning around, right? Guess again. On the way, you run into the Lazurian army. Turns out the two countries were at war for 100 years before the meteors dropped. Naturally, that war is still raging, adding another danger to a world already full of it. Oh, and remember those raiders? The mysterious new villain named Calder resupplied them. At the same time, Isabella contracts the flower virus, making her march to the shelter that much more important. Thankfully, you do eventually find the shelter, Isabella gets cured, and we jump ahead to a year after the meteor shower. Of course, things haven't improved. There's too many people in the shelter, food's low, and the war between Rubinel, which is you, and Lazuria is still raging, despite Captain Brenner wondering what they're possibly fighting over. The war between the two nations continues, even as Will pleads with the other side to stop, and along the way you find Admiral Greyfield. He wants to kill all Lazurians and rule the world as king. He's a real nice guy if you couldn't tell already. Along with being a raging psychopath, Greyfield is also a major buttface. Just to spite you, in one of the missions, he assesses which units you have the most of, then forbids you from using them the following turn. Real buttface move. To further prove his buttfaceness, you win the war against General Forsyth and the Lazurians. Brenner accepts their surrender, but Greyfield shows up, executes Forsyth, and declares himself king. And if you're keeping track, all of this is happening before the true villain, Calder, has even revealed himself to the good guys. Now, I know what you're thinking. Brenner and Lynn totally banged in the shelter and Will probably watched. And you don't have to worry, I'll stop talking about the story here, because if I went any further, I'd be spoiling a lot of the crazy moments still to come. And the reason I want to keep spoilers to a minimum is because the game is still worth playing all these years later. However, I will say that Admiral Buttface gets even worse, the game gets more depressing, and that virus becomes even more deadly. Considering the fact that I just spent all that time making you sad, it's clear to see why Days of Ruin is the forgotten game in the franchise and why Intelligent Systems hasn't made another one since. The first 3 games in the series have that lighthearted take on war with a peppy little song playing after each mission victory. Days of Ruin goes for realism, which would have been fine, except they tossed in the world's most depressing story on top of it. The world's ended, a deadly virus kills all the young people, and a group of psychopaths are doing their best to exterminate everyone else who remains. There are times when a sad story makes sense, just not in this franchise. Like I said earlier, Advance Wars was always about a surface-level story of good versus evil, with good ultimately winning without too many casualties. You could sit back and just enjoy the stellar gameplay rather than worrying about the implications of war. With Days of Ruin, though, the game starts off with good losing, continues with good losing and barely surviving, and ends with something I won't spoil. But that's the main reason why I think the franchise ended in 2008, the depressingness. I'll admit I'm a huge fan of Dual Strike. I've sunk countless hours into it, beaten the game multiple times on all the difficulty levels, spent more time than I care to admit in the real-time minigame, and probably played through every single bonus map. If you were to ask me what my favorite game of all time is, I would probably say Dual Strike. Resident Evil 4 is the best game I've ever played, but Dual Strike has the longevity a game like Resident Evil lacks. So when I bought Days of Ruin when it first came out, and all the color and all the fun was removed, I hated it. In fact, I never beat Days of Ruin my first time owning it, and I sold it right after. Several years later, I did return to Days of Ruin with an open mind and a willingness to see it through to the end, and that's where the brilliance finally shone through. In terms of gameplay, Days of Ruin is Advance Wars at its core, but there's noticeable differences from Dual Strike right off the bat. For starters, units that destroy another unit level up, making them slightly stronger. Additionally, we have some new units like the War Tank and Flare, though the Flare unit is rarely useful in the campaign. The Battleship, meanwhile, is way too powerful, allowing you to move and indirectly attack in the same turn. Now, easily the biggest change to the Advance Wars formula is the nerfing of CO powers, and in turn, a lot of the fun Advance Wars had. Instead of taking back-to-back turns like you did in Dual Strike and unleashing game-changing powers, now you get to move an extra 2 spaces or see a little further in Fog of War, which is completely useless when you're forced to use Lin on a regular map. And if you want to build up your CO gauge, good freaking luck. I used my first CO power in Mission 20, that's near the tail end of what turns out to be a fairly short campaign, and it barely had any effect on the battle. In total, I used my CO power twice during the entire campaign. In Dual Strike, I'd use my CO power twice per mission. It's also disappointing that your CO gauge doesn't fill automatically. Instead, you have to put your CO in a unit, then have nearby units attack. It just saps a lot of the fun that Dual Strike had out of the experience. Once you get used to the fact that Days of Ruin is more realistic though, it becomes a brilliant gaming experience. You finally start to care about each unit and their capabilities, and strategy becomes even more important. It's less about spamming the strongest units and overwhelming your opponent while building up your CO power. Now you have to strategize, use the battlefield to your advantage, pick and choose which units to level up, and create a convoy instead of sending a single unit to destroy everything. It's like Intelligent Systems wanted to add that permadeath element to Advance Wars, knew they couldn't do it justice, so they created a story that forced you to think death was permanent. And if you weren't prepared for something like that, you were going to hate the game like I did at first. And as I mentioned, I believe that's what killed Advance Wars and resulted in Nintendo losing confidence in the franchise. Intelligent Systems went too dark, too fast, too furious. People who enjoyed the first 3 games were turned off by the sudden change. It's not that Days of Ruin is a bad game, it's actually one of the best games on DS, albeit with far fewer features than Dual Strike, it's just that it didn't feel like Advance Wars. My worry with the new Advance Wars is them making it more like Fire Emblem and having CO permadeath and relationships between the characters, because that's what's been successful. Advance Wars needs to go back to Dual Strike and just not take itself too seriously. Copying another franchise would be a massive disservice to the brilliant games up to this point. But hopefully the sins of Days of Ruin will be erased when Advance Wars 1 and 2 launch on Nintendo Switch this year. If it does well, maybe this means the franchise can continue. At the very least, Nintendo is giving us a chance, and I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes the best-selling Advance Wars game ever, not that it has much of a high bar to reach. Or maybe Nintendo is gauging the interest for other remasters. And if you're looking closely enough, you'll realize there's another GBA series from Nintendo that died on DS and deserves a comeback. I tried to think of a clever hint for Golden Sun, but it's Golden Sun. The franchise is Golden Sun. Please, Nintendo, give us Golden Sun on Switch.